Hi there, welcome back to the Go Draft. I'm Andy Guerdat. I thought I would take a few minutes to give you a short overview, a history of our profession, how it came to be, and how women, by and large, invented what we do for a living. And that way you can sort of get an idea also of where and how you fit in on the continuum that is the screenwriting experience. In 1911, a woman named Anita Loos, Loos, was a kind of a knockaround actor, sometimes playwright, in a traveling company of actors on the West Coast, from San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, that area. And in 1911, this was kind of the Wild West out here. Those were all port cities where sailors, went to blow off steam, and cowboys and lumbermen and miners still came into town to blow off steam. So it was a pretty rough, wild, and woolly area and time. So she was an actor in a company in San Diego at the time. And the theater, after the show, would show what was a new concept, these things called motion pictures. They would show a little one-reeler, just a few minutes long after the performance of the play. So she was interested. So she would, after the show, she'd run around to the back of the theater to watch the movie. And she did. And when she did, she said something to herself that every screenwriter has said ever since, which was, I can do better than that. And so she wrote up some kind of a story called He Was a College Boy. And knowing Anita Loos's work later, it was probably sort of a sexy comedy, I would guess. She wrote it up in some form, probably looked sort of like what we would call a treatment, and mailed it off to Biograph Pictures, which was the motion picture company that had made that particular movie. It's one of the larger of the motion picture companies in those early days. He just sent it off blind, and a few weeks later she got a check for $25, which in 1911 was a lot of money. And so she said, okay, I'll do more of that. And by 1915, she had written 105 screenplays. And D.W. Griffith, who was one of the owners of Biograph Pictures, when he and the others decided to move their companies from the New York area, which was where most early motion picture films were made, because that's where the actors were, they decided to move from New York to the West Coast, largely to get away from Thomas Edison, who owned the patent on the motion picture camera, was trying to charge everybody who made a movie. He was trying to charge them money. So they figured if we moved a continent away, maybe we can get away from them, and it kind of worked. And also because the weather here, I'm looking out the window now, and it's nice and sunny, in Southern California is perfect for making movies. And so he convinced Anita Loos, this woman who had been sending him these great stories to do, he convinced her to move up to this tiny little cow town called Hollywood, and they set up shop there, and she became the first staff writer in history. She was paid $75 a week. After a while, she got so successful she was making $500 a week, which was a fortune in those early days. She also wrote short stories for Harper's Bazaar, which featured a character called Lorelei Lee, who was the ultimate gold digger. It was a kind of a sexy flapper who used her sexuality in order to get money and jewelry out of wealthy guys. And the short stories became so popular, she published them into a novel called Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which then became a film, which then became a stage play, which then ultimately became a musical, which is one of the things that made a star out of Marilyn Monroe.
A kiss on the hand may be quite continental, but diamonds are a girl's best friend. A kiss may be grand, but it won't pay the rental on your humble flat, or help you at the automat. Men grow cold as girls grow old, and we all lose our charms in the end. But square cut or pear shape, these rocks don't lose their shape. Diamonds are a girl's best friend.
Anita Luce also co-wrote a movie called The Women in 1939, which is a movie that featured nothing but women in the cast, no men whatsoever. And it was very funny and sexy and very much a progenitor of what would become things like Sex and the City.
And by the way, there's a name for you ladies, but it isn't used in high society, outside of a kennel. So long, ladies. Oh,
Anita Luce also wrote the stage play Gigi, which went on to make a star out of Audrey Hepburn. She wrote the first screenwriting book called How to Write Photoplays in 1920. So she invented what I'm doing right now. She was amazing, an amazing person. And on top of all of that, if that's not enough, she was probably the coolest and hottest woman in history. I mean, come on, was she the coolest ever or what? But she wasn't the only woman who invented screenwriting. Frances Marion, starting in 1914, wrote 325 screenplays, including The Champ, Dinner at 8, Camille, Night Without Armor. She was the first writer to win 2 Academy Awards. She directed 3 movies. She was a war correspondent in World War I. Jane Murfin. She wrote 55 movies, 5 plays, and she created the first canine movie star before Rin Tin Tin or Lassie. She created a character named Strongheart, a dog who went on to become a movie star. There was Lois Weber. She wrote 114 movies, directed 135. She invented the split screen. She did some of the first sound movies. She owned a movie studio. How cool is that? There was June Mathis. June Mathis sold her first script in 1915. She made over 100 movies as a writer, director, editor. She created much of what is now the standard screenplay format. In 1919, she was named head of the screenwriting department at MGM and perhaps the most powerful woman in Hollywood. She discovered Rudolph Valentino. So how did these women come to dominate early screenwriting? And it wasn't because it was prestigious. It's exactly because it wasn't prestigious, because men didn't want to do it. In those days, real writers wrote novels and plays, and screenwriting was considered sort of a silly trend, a fad. I don't know what it would be equivalent to now. It would be equivalent to writing, I don't know, writing captions for memes or something on the internet. It's really, you're going to pay me a few bucks for that, okay, but it's certainly not anything I particularly want to do. Eventually, as the movie industry became more and more successful and more money, it was clear you could make money doing it. Of course, the male writers, playwrights and novelists and so on, from the East Coast especially, started to move out to Hollywood because the money was there. In 1927, a wonderful writer named Herman Mankiewicz moved from New York to LA to get in on this thing, and he sent a telegram to his friend Ben Hecht in New York. It said words to the effect of, "Come out to Hollywood. Millions are to be made, and your only competition are idiots." Ben Hecht was a great journalist, a great novelist, and a playwright. He wrote, among other things, The Front Page. Ben Hecht probably was the greatest screenwriter in history. He wrote 70 credited screenplays and hundreds more of uncredited rewrites on great films. He wrote the original Scarface. He wrote Nothing Sacred, which was one of the first screwball comedies. He wrote Gunga Din. He wrote Wuthering Heights, Spellbound, Notorious. He even wrote a script for Casino Royale, the James Bond, would have been the first James Bond movie, and turned it in just before he died. His screenplay was never made. I've never read it, but I've heard it was pretty great. The idea of Ben Hecht writing the first James Bond movie is too cool for words. Ben Hecht won the first Academy Award for screenwriting in 1927. And not only was he not honored, he was offended because, again, real writers, in his mind, wrote novels and plays, as he did, and was a great journalist as well. So he didn't want to be acknowledged for writing what he considered to be far beneath him. And because of that attitude, early screenwriters didn't care about things like owning the copyright to their work. the way you do when you write a play. You own the copyright. When you write a novel, you own the copyright. When you write a screenplay, you do not own the copyright. The studio owns the copyright. When you sell a movie to a major studio, a major producer, you have to sign a piece of paper that says Paramount Pictures or whatever is the author of this work. Author is the word they use. They own the copyright. And because you can say, well, I wouldn't sign it, in which case that's fine, but you're not going to get paid and they're not going to make your movie. So if you want to get paid and you want to get your movie made, you have to sign that piece of paper. Because of that quirk, because those early screenwriters didn't think anything about owning it, it would be like if you wrote greeting cards or something. I don't know. I don't care about owning a greeting card. Who cares? And that was their attitude. Because of that, the Screenwriters Guild was formed eventually in 1933 in order to get basic rights. If we couldn't get copyright, and we still don't have copyright, at least we would get some control over the credits, because in the early days, those producers would stick their own name on as the writer, or they'd stick their girlfriend's name on as a writer. People still do that, by the way. If you work outside the Writers Guild, you have no control. They can do anything they want with the credits. The Writers Guild got minimum basic pay, and eventually residuals and royalties, so that we would get paid something for our work when it was used and reused and reused. In fact, here's what a residual check looks like. This is a residual check here for 1 penny that I got. There we go, 1 penny for something from Disney. I forgot what it was. I never bothered to cash it. It's too cool having a check for 1 penny. By the way, Frances Marion was the first vice president of the Screenwriters Guild. And her competition when she was running for vice president were Anita Luce and Jane Murfin. There are many great female screenwriters now, of course, but they're hamstrung to a large degree by the expectations of political forces that try to force them to write about certain subjects and take very safe approaches to those subjects, and often with a deadly earnestness, which makes the work less powerful and compelling than it ought to be. Early screenwriters, female screenwriters, didn't really do that. They didn't just write morality tales and romantic comedies and little family dramas. They wrote everything. Frances Marion wrote The Son of the Sheik, which features a lot of action and a lot of sex. Anita Luce co-wrote a movie called, in 1933, called A Night in Cairo, also known as The Barbarian, which is very sexual, has a very dangerous sexuality. You'd never get away with it now. June Mathis wrote The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which was an early war movie. Frances Marion wrote The Big House, which was perhaps the first prison movie, very masculine subject. Somewhat later, female screenwriters like Marguerite Roberts wrote all kinds of things. She wrote 34 screenplays before she was blacklisted in the 1950s. But she wrote westerns. She wrote adventure stories. She wrote True Grit, the first True Grit, Five Card Stud, Ivanhoe. Dorothy Parker, she was a famous wit, of course, but she also wrote screenplays. She co-wrote A Star is Born, which has only been remade, 3 times, 4 times? I forget. She also co-wrote the Alfred Hitchcock adventure story, Saboteur. Later, those women worked mainly in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Harriet Frank wrote in the 60s and 70s, and she wrote westerns and gritty dramas like Hombre and HUD and Norma Ray and the Cowboys. Lee Brackett, she was a science fiction novelist, and the director Howard Hawks, who was famously macho, read one of her stories, one of her novels, and thought she was a man because of the name Lee, and sent for him to come to Hollywood and work on The Big Sleep, which he was directing, a tough, gritty detective noir story, and she co-wrote The Big Sleep. Later, she co-wrote The Long Goodbye, another Raymond Chandler noir. She wrote westerns like Rio Bravo and El Dorado. She co-wrote, if her name seems familiar to you, but you can't figure out why, she co-wrote The Empire Strikes Back. She turned in her draft just before she died at the age of 62. There's just some of the women who invented screenwriting. And it's funny, I've yet to meet a woman writer in Hollywood of any age, I think, who's heard of any of them. When I started writing in television, there were virtually no women no women comedy writers on staff, almost none. If there was a woman on a staff, it was an oddity. Within 5 years, there was a woman on almost every writing staff. And now, in the writing staff I work with now at Disney is half women, and nobody thinks anything about it. The world has changed dramatically. I'll finish with a goofy little story. My wife is also a comedy writer. And in 1987, she was writing an episode of The Facts of Life. And she also, as she was writing it, she was pregnant with our daughter. And in those days, there was no maternity leave, no paternity leave, no leave of any kind. Anyway, she was, I was just about to take her to the hospital to give birth, and we got a phone call, and it was the executive producer of The Facts of Life. And the executive producer said, "So when can I see that first draft?" And she said, "Well, I just went into labor and my husband's about to take me to the hospital." And the executive producer said, "Yeah, so when can I see the first draft?" And that executive producer was a woman. So it just goes to show you that women, when they given the opportunity to become major producers, can be just as big of a jerk as men can. Anyway, that's a short overview of the history of screenwriting. And we'll talk soon about more subjects to come.